Welcome to the surprise talk, by which I mean it was a surprise for me to have to give it. So what I'm going to do is to try to give you some glimpses into a piece that Azim, Iyad, and I have been working on, which is about the complicated enterprise that we've started to call science fiction science. So I'll come to the science part in a bit, but just for now, let's start with the science fiction. So imagine with me. This is the future. Well, one possible future. So on the left, there is a fertility clinic where babies have been selected by future parents on the basis of a polygenic screening of their DNA and machine learning predictions about their phenotypes. And these babies will grow into these young adults that you see on the right, who live in a society where machines are continuously computing, updating, and releasing a score that is supposed to capture your quality as a human being for everyone else to see. So this, of course, could be a great pitch for a Netflix show, let's say. You know, in this show, we would follow the fate of these characters, we would witness their ethical dilemmas, we would observe the new social norms and the new behaviors that were triggered by this eruption of these transformative technologies. But the thing is that the discourse around this technology is not only to be found in science fiction shows. There's already a substantial literature in social sciences and in the humanities trying to anticipate what will actually be the impact of these technologies on social norms, laws, behaviors, or institutions. Now, this discourse is typically qualitative. People who are trying to anticipate the impact of these technologies are typically philosophers, ethicists, ethnographers, sociologists, critical theorists. So the output of their analysis is a qualitative discourse, trying to predict what is going to happen to people in society with these transformative technologies. What we don't have so much is a quantitative approach to the same problem. Can we quantify, can we predict, based on experimental methods, the same output, which is the potential impact on society and behavior of these transformative technologies? So this is our starting problem. So let's phrase it that way. There is a technology. Insert whatever you want. There is a technology that is not available yet. It does not exist. But we think that when this technology materializes, there's going to be a transformative impact on behavior, social norms, and social institutions. And we're worried about this impact because we think it's going to be large, and it's ambiguous whether it's going to be positive or negative. It's probably going to be a mixture of positive and negative impacts. And this large and ambiguous impact is sufficiently worrying that we would like to have some kind of quantitative estimation provided by scientific experimental methods. But of course, as we all realize, the problem is that we're completely flying blind because the technology does not exist yet. So we're not sure about its specification. We're not sure about what the technology will or will not be able to do, or in which form it will be made available to people. Those people who will use the technology and be affected by it do not exist. They're in the future. And they might be very different from the people we have access right now, that is people from the present, you. And they might be very different from the people from the present, largely because the social context might be very different by the time the technology is invented. This technology will come in a society that has already changed compared to the society we have. So what we need is to start agreeing that, well, either we just quit and we say these problems are just too large, and so we just don't even try to have experiments and quantitative estimations of the impact of this technology, and we leave this task to people who are doing qualitative research, and this is certainly an option. Or we try, as a community, to start discussing what could be the principles, the heuristics, and the methods that could be used for this enterprise that we're calling, at the moment, within our group, science fiction science. And we call it science fiction science because, essentially, it's the application of the scientific method to the science fiction project. So the science fiction project, the whole gist of science fiction is that writers create this very rich environment for the readers to immerse into and experience thought experiments. So a good science fiction writer will be essentially a creator of an elaborate thought experiment for you. You will be led to think about what people will do, how they will react, what society will do when some form of advanced technology is made available. So we call this science fiction science because what we want to do is to turn the thought experiments of science fiction into behavioral experiments in the lab. That means that we want to recruit participants from the present, because of course that's all we have access to. We recruit people from the present, we randomly assign them to control variation of possible futures, and then we design in this control variation of the future an encounter with a technology that we simulate for them so that they can experience it. And during or after that experience, we collect quantitative behavioral measures or quantitative attitudes they express toward the technology. So, how can we start agreeing on the list of principles, heuristics, and methods? So it's probably reasonable to start with the what's, which is which kind of heuristic can we apply to decide what is or is not a reasonable technology to study? Because some technologies will be much harder to study than others. The problem here is what some people call temporal validity, but it's a very special case of temporal validity. When people speak of temporal validity, they usually mean the problems of knowledge decay, something that we've already discussed in the panel just before this presentation. We're studying a currently available technology, and we're getting information and findings from this current technology, but the knowledge we produce has a high decay rate across time because the technology changes fast. And so the knowledge we produce loses its value with the progress of the technology. That's knowledge decay, and that's one form of temporal validity issue. But with science fiction science, we have the opposite problem. We're producing findings which have very questionable value at the moment we're producing them because they're relevant to one possible future. The future where the technology we've simulated materializes pretty much or broadly as we anticipated it would materialize in a social context that is broadly as we expected it was going to be. So we're making a series of bets, and we hope that in the future these bets will pay off because we made the bet properly, or we were lucky in a way, so that the technology and the context that we simulated are going to materialize approximately in this way, which means that our results will suddenly gain enormous value. No. That means we have to make either risky or cautious bets. And risky bets are interesting, of course, and can be very exciting. We can bet on extremely exciting new disruptive technology, or we can perhaps try to be more cautious and try to make bets which are more likely to actually win. So this is our just heuristics, but we consider, for example, at the moment that it's maybe not as exciting, but it's safer to stick to the near future. So using chatbots for therapy is not something that is globally available yet, but it's likely to be possible in the near term. So it's not an enormous bet on the future, but doing behavioral studies of how people might use supersonic self-driving cars, that's much more risky. That's not going to happen in the next 15 years or 50 years. So everything by that time would have changed so much that there's probably no way we can make safe bets about what to simulate in our experiments. So stick to the near future, and in the same logic, it's probably safer to stick to proximal effects of the technology. That is, the effects of the technology that will materialize very soon after it's available. So for example, one thing that might not be reasonable is to say, okay, we have polygenic screening, and parents start to select out some phenotypes, say deafness. Parents start to select out deafness. And we want to know if 2 generations down the line, society has evolved strong prejudice against deaf people. That's probably too ambitious, because we cannot make safe bets about what's going to happen 20 years or 15 years, 2 generations down the line after the invention of a technology. So proximate effects probably safer than long-term effects. And of course, it's better probably to stick to moderate transformations, because the end of aging, for example, well, who knows, that might happen in your lifetime. I'm looking at the youngest people in the room. But this would be such a game changer, actual anti-aging treatment. It would be such a game changer to all aspects of the human experience and to all aspects of society that it's probably pointless to try to predict it. Okay, so these were the whats. No, let me get through quickly through some methods, some example of methods we want to use. So basically, all the methods we're suggesting follow the same logic. We recruit participants from the present to basically role play people from the future. So we need to help them get into character and stay in character. So for example, we need to help participants situate in the future, and for this, we need to use what science fiction writers call world-building techniques. We need to give people those little details about the future that will help them get in characters. And for this, we turn to this fascinating field, which is called experiential ethnographic futures, which is essentially ethnographers trying to observe the life of future people by creating incredibly immersive experiences for them so that they get into character as people living in the future. And so this are example in a paper that shows, for example, the physical props that these ethnographers create to try to help people experience a world where climate activism has reached a stage where people use this electrical contraption to generate surges as sabotage actions during scientific conferences. People can actually send mock Wikipedia articles describing the technology and describing the social debates around the technology. There are advertisements for people to peruse. So this one is for something that transforms your fat into electricity, which sounds pretty cool. So we can very presumably take a page from their book and use those techniques to actually help people situate themselves, immerse themselves in the future. Of course, we need to simulate the technology for people. And there are many ways we can simulate the technological encounter. So right now, when people try to study things like that, well, they use vignettes, like verbal descriptions of the technology with perhaps some visuals. That's what we did in a moral machine. And in many cases, it's probably enough, right? But, of course, in some cases, and maybe I'll have time to discuss when, maybe not, in some cases, you may want to elevate a notch the fidelity of the simulation. So you might turn to virtual reality. So for example, instead of describing a self-driving car scenario, you can actually put people in virtual reality so that they can see and experience in VR the self-driving car scenario. If you have a lot of money and a lot of time, you can go all Chinese government and create a Mars base in the Gobi Desert, right? And then run all your experiments in this kind of huge physical simulation of the future. But of course, nowadays, the easiest thing we can do is to create digital simulation of technologies. So for example, on the right side, this is a simulated app where you can have a chat with me, and your large language model is trying to detect when I'm lying to you in the text conversation. So in this situation, I'm claiming that I forgot about the meeting, and I am now in another meeting, but your phone is telling you, nope, high chance of insincerity. So this is something we can easily provide to people, and in no small part because of the magic of large language models. Because nowadays, you know, the problem with large language models is that they can always pretend that they know how to do something. You ask them to do something, they will try to improvise a response. But the beauty of that is that we can use them to simulate any kind of technology because they will always be happy to pretend there's something they're not yet. And this one, okay, it's just one example, and it has a cute name. We call that method asking, like method acting. So it's a way to ask people questions, but in a way that helps them stay in character as someone from the future. So imagine I've just gone through the pain of immersing you in experiments where you discovered the future issue of sex with robots. And now I want to know, for example, what are your feelings about sex with robots and the people who have it. And I could tell you, okay, end of the simulation, here's a list of items on a scale from 1 to 7, rate your agreement that having sex with robots should be illegal, and so on and so on. You don't need to be a behavioral psychologist to realize that this is immersion breaking. Suddenly, you've gone through great pain to take people in this simulation of the future, and you suddenly breaking character, bring them back to the present, and then what are they going to do? Well, they're going to give you their impression as people from the present, instead of staying in a character as people from the future. And one way you can solve this problem is by designing ways to ask the questions that are still immersive. So instead of asking people to rate their agreement with the statements, you can provide them with a simulated social media feed, where people are expressing these views and asking people to like the comments they agree to with the pause, so that they stay in character as someone who is participating in this debate in the future. And so to conclude, the problem is, of course, once we've gone through all the suggestions of world-building techniques and simulation techniques and, you know, a clever way to ask questions, when do we use the techniques? In which combination? When is the appropriate time to use them in a study? And then we can all together try to come up with reasonable suggestions. For example, depending on whether the technology that is the target of your study is something you actively engage with or you passively experience, then you might want to do more simulation for things people actively engage with, more world building if this is a technology that people passively experience in the future. Is it easy or hard to mentally picture? Because, for example, being in the self-driving car is probably not that hard to imagine. People have enough frame of reference for this. So if it's really easy to imagine, then you're probably safe with vignettes, because people don't need your help. If it's really hard to imagine, that's where you want to go for the higher fidelity simulation and design the mock apps that will, you know, just give people this experience that's hard to describe right now. What are you going to include in your world building, in this, you know, small details and props that you're going to construct for the subject to situate themselves in the future? That's probably something you should ask the subject themselves. That's probably something for pilot studies. Like you run the bare bone version of your experiment for pilot participants, and you ask those pilot study participants, so which were the questions that popped up in your mind? What did you find confusing? What were the questions you had about this future world? You know, and I'm going to help you. Help me help the future participants to not ask themselves all these questions. When do I need this cute method asking techniques? Well, probably anytime you really want to divorce the answer of people in your experiment from their present experience. And one typical cases would be when the technology you're studying currently exists in some preliminary form that people have access to. Because this is precisely a situation where you don't want people to come back to the present at the end of your experiment and give you answers that actually relate to their current experience of the technology that exists right now. You want them to stay in the future and to answer questions about this new form of technology that you made them experience. Now, I'm just going to conclude there. One of our goals here, and we hope that this will be, again, a collective conversation, is that these methods might feel weird. that people who do this kind of studies, trying to experiment on the future, might not want to risk using unusual methods like this ones because they fear that reviewers are going to be, well, disturbed or shocked by this kind of technique. So what we really want to start doing is to start normalizing the unusual methods that might be used for the unusual enterprise of running experiments in the future. Thank you.
Great. Well, as the last speaker in the conference note, there's a poster session, of course, but I will take 1 minute from my 20 minutes to really thank on behalf, I think, of all the speakers, of the attendants and the poster givers, the organizer, Ayad, Jean-François, and Azim were missing, unfortunately, today, but also all the team behind the scenes. So we've interacted some of it with Joanna, but also I know that lots of the team from the MPI has been helping, and the technical staff and so on. So if you would join me in this kind of collective it's no small work to bring people together, so really, really delighted to be here. And yes, so I will give a relatively high-level talk. Don't expect like either deep analytic philosophy, which I also do, or lots of like experimental details, which I also do. And actually, there's a lot of convergence with Jean-François' talk, so that's great. And I will start actually with a kind of unusual, entertaining story, hopefully. I don't expect anybody here to recognize this man. He's actually the inspiration for the character in Forrest Gump, for people who have seen the movie. He's known as Albert Dadas. He lived at the end of the 19th century, and he was known as the running man. It just so happened that at the age of 8, Dadas had a brain injury, and after that, at the age of 12, he just disappeared at some point from his family, and he was found like 100 kilometers away by his brother on a visit a month after, working in an umbrella factory, having no recollection at all of who he was. And upon seeing his brother, he was reminded who he was, and then came back home. But after that, he kept feeling a very pressing urge to run and walk, and he would just suddenly set up towards a random direction whenever he would hear, for instance, his father saying he would have business in Arcachon. He would start sort of heading there. He was found at the end as far as Algeria, Constantinople, picked up back in Paris, and even in Moscow, where he was arrested. So it was an interesting case, but really he became very famous because in 1887, he was actually sent to a young doctor, Philippe Tissier, who actually diagnosed him as the first known case of a new pathology called dromomaniac. So dromo comes from the Greek, like running, the mania of running, or the mad tourism. Later on, Charcot actually commented on this case, and afterwards, after this case was labeled, cases of mad travelers were starting to be reported everywhere, not only from Bordeaux, but they spread in the rest of France, and then Italy, Germany, Russia. There was a huge spike of dissertations on the topic. That spike actually stopped, and then it actually survived, and now it's actually also reported in the DSM. So you may wonder why I'm telling this story, but hold on 1 second. Let's move to another case. We've seen that picture already in a young talk. So this is Kondo Akiko. This is his Gatebox, this kind of AI technology that can conjure up an hologram and a chat character. And there's a part of the story here, beside the fact that you pay about $2,000 to buy this, and then there's a very expensive subscription. But Kondo was obviously rich enough to actually pay also $20,000 to actually marry his hologram. And in this case, it was in 2018, and a year before, actually, Gatebox had decided to issue a new sort of concept or a part of the package, the bundle, that you could get a wedding certificate. You could marry your hologram. Independently, actually, he was interviewed by many newspapers and actually reported that he had found this category on the web of people who were fictosexual, that is, people who fell in love with fictional characters. So now you start to see where I'm going. The fact that the label dromomaniac, as much as this label fictosexual or the affordances that the new technologies give us, actually also creates the very phenomenon that we're studying. The proof is that in the same case that there was a spread, there was kind of, Dada was a kind of patient zero of dromomania and mad travelers. Kondo Akiko on this affordance was actually patient zero of people marrying their gatebox. There are now more than 4,000 people who are happily, I hope, married with their gatebox characters. But in the vicinity of this phenomenon, we have associations for rights to marry robots. And in political debates, we heard about the connection between science and policy. Some of these topics also are being discussed. So these new concepts or these new affordances and the way we start to report them scientifically start to shape the very phenomenon that we keep sort of studying, and then we need to reconceptualize. Actually, the reason why I chose Dada is because it was the case that was partly theorized by Ian Hacking, a philosopher of science, who died last year. And he actually named this case the case of interactive kinds. That is a case where a scientific concept or the way we decide to label, to define, to study, and to implement in our method a certain phenomenon start to shape the very reality that was picking on. So you can imagine a noisy reality, obviously there was something wrong with Dada, nobody objects. But the way you start to theorize about it shapes other cases, and then you have a cluster of phenomena that will shape the concept again, and that's how the field starts to evolve. Hacking thought that this was actually sort of inevitable in the social sciences because people start to recognize themselves in the labels provided by scientists. We know this, for instance, from cases of high-functioning autism or other concepts also have this kind of effect on reality, shaping how people consider themselves. And he contrasted it with another sort of form of scientific inquiries, which is concerned with what he called indifferent kinds. So you can imagine that if you're a chemist, how you label the molecule will not change the molecule. Right? It will just remain, you may be right or wrong, but it will not transform the very phenomenon that you're studying. So for me, navigating between the field of cognitive science and the field of machine plus behavior, what I find striking, and this is why I said it's a kind of high-level talk, is that whenever we start to study or use the terms like artificial agent, it was noticed before, or machine consciousness, or things like having to do with artificial memory enhancement and neurotechnologies, I always feel that we are picking up on some noisy phenomena. There's something there, but then we decide to label them, for instance, as agents before we have full evidence or full understanding that they're really agency, or we start talking about machine morality before we even know, as you were saying earlier, that there is some moral phenomenon we're capturing. And then we inspire other people in the computer science community or users to actually respond in a certain way. And then the phenomenon gets richer, and then we start to study it even more. And it's very different indeed when I study, for instance, artificial agents, very different from the way I study a human agent. Then I'm doing indifferent kind. The way I think about the sense of agency will not change how a human agent operates. There is no, the same for consciousness. We have big mysteries, but it will not, my research or community research will not shape the phenomenon we study. Now, it's very important here to say that, I picked here some concepts, we could sort of enrich them. Not all of the topics that have been discussed today, and that was very instructive, actually fall in the kind of, on the left side, which is the the interactive kinds. Some machine behaviors, I think the benchmarking work, for instance, intends to be actually trying to pick up a reality and establish a characterization, which is more like an indifferent kind. So maybe for the field, it's interesting to think, when are we trying to be sort of documenting as an indifferent kind, and when are we sort of doing the social science thing where we're actually shaping the reality that we also study. So as I said, this is not, there's a big debate, but this is not necessarily a sort of problem for objectivity. It's just that basically the science looks like this, like the scientific concept shape reality, and you're always one step beyond a bit what you're trying to study, but you also influence it in a way. So which reality do we talk about in this case of AI? I think, well, obviously, for instance, with AI consciousness and awareness, there was a big European call, for instance, to put awareness in AI, and now people are trying to put more awareness in AI. So, it will probably go somewhere, and then we'll have a new phenomenon to study. So it shapes AI itself. It shapes also sometimes the concepts we put out there, as we discussed during the panel with the journal editors, shapes also the policy or how people receive the science at the higher level. But also, and that's more what we study, that I think that sometimes the way we decide to label things will actually shape human expectations or behavior toward the very technology. And I think here the moral machine, is a good example. I think it's raised a lot of awareness in humans also and technologists regarding expectations for a self-driving car. So the status of concepts, very nice to have the talk by Jean-François before to think about, the one that we import. And here's at least 3 kinds of concepts we can import. We can import total fictions that are just coming out of, the wide imagination, but have maybe no pretense to really be plausibly implemented in the future. We have also the possibility to, I think we were talking about turning them into more like forecasts. What are the short-term disruptive possibilities? Maybe being a conversational agent is closer than being a moral agent. So that's the kind of forecast that we can have. But I tend to see a lot of these things as more like speculations. That is, we have a sense or a hint that this way of conceptualizing the AI reality is accurate, but we have no real way of deciding exactly how certain or uncertain they are. And as evidence, I don't know how many of you have seen this preprint. It's a sort of survey with about like 2,800 representatives of AI community asked to actually say when certain transformation in the field will happen. And the middle point that you see, the shape, is actually the 50% probability. And the end, it's the confidence interval is the confidence of the participants. The lower end is when people say 25% probability, and the lower end 75% probability. So the way you read this, for instance, the probability of an AI researcher, very relevant for us, 50% probability that in 2063 this will happen. But you can see that people push it quite far away in the future. Install wiring in the house, probably in our lifetime. But again, wide, imprecise probabilities. The paper, I just, I encourage you to look at it, go further into sort of more details, but folding laundry is very far away. So we are more likely to see actually LLM answer undecided questions well than folding laundry. It's terrible because I would prefer if it folds my laundry and I keep trying to answer undecided questions, but that's how the community sees it. So I think this, the fact that at least part of the concepts that are being applied, things like moral agent or machine consciousness of this interactive kinds actually has a very high relevance, shows the very high relevance of the research that is being done, and along the line that Jean-François and I were saying, we really need to study what will be the effect of this future technology. And it brings a lot of responsibility challenges for the research as well. So very briefly, I want to just show 3 ways in which we try in the research group to sort of take this responsibility seriously, or the way we phrase some of these challenges. The first one, I think we try to do more, and it was also part of the discussion at the early afternoon, is to acknowledge uncertainty. When we use these terms like AI agent or moral agent, we tend not to sort of preface it to say, of course, it's highly uncertain that there is agency, you know, because we usually speak within a community where these uncertainties are known. But let's not do again what the climate scientists have done, which is to not voice the uncertainty and then have a backfiring because we haven't been, as a community, sort of transparent enough regarding the levels of uncertainty. So when you look at the science of science communication, there is wide evidence that communicating to the public or the policymakers or to people in other disciplines about our levels of uncertainty is really crucial. And I think that's really an aspect that we have to sort of take seriously. Even more so that the data that we have on how the public actually understand conversational agents is not very rich. There's this UK survey that shows in 2016 that only 9% of the public had heard the term machine learning, but I think many more of them have heard conversational agents and they've interacted with them. So, you know, we have a huge sort of understanding here to understand what's the understanding around the uncertainty regarding, for instance, how much agency there is in these entities there is. We also need to understand, and this was coming back to things that Mi-Young was saying, you know, what are the news about AI that are likely to spread? We study misinformation, but what about the information coming from this very community? What are the things that out there people are picking up on Twitter or not, you know? And here, at least from the research that we've been doing, we see that all the more anthropomorphic descriptions, the more, let's say, science fiction ones are much more successful than the more reasonable. And therefore, that's also something that we need to think about together, and not just us, but also the educators and everybody who has a say in talking to the public. Another part that was mentioned, so as maybe was clear in the case of Dada and elsewhere in the marriage with holograms, in many cases, you know, the terms come about after very little evidence, so there's no easy evidence, and then a phenomenon is coined. And the way the scientific community is done is that once a paper is published and successful with a term, you just borrow that term and then it flies, right? That's the so. In order to avoid, let's say, you know, labeling something as a moral agent or as conscious before, we need, of course, more data. But mostly in the phenomena that we study, before, for instance, concluding that there is something like algorithm aversion or algorithm exploitation, or that people behave in a certain way towards a new technology, we need actually data from the people who don't usually come to our labs or are not on Mechanical Turk. So closing data gaps, I think, is really very important to study the human behavior. Getting data from more diverse people at more scales as well. So as David was saying, you know, we tend to study individuals, but I think that a lot of the responses to these technologies are at the level of small groups. That is, you know, teams of workers, groups of researchers, family members, groups of friends, and that's really what we have specialized in the research group. And individuals' responses and small group responses are not the same. I briefly mentioned actually that when it comes to closing data gaps, we're actually in trouble. I just wanted to show briefly, this is a sort of quick advertising for this new project on data sharing. So if large language models and the understanding of human behavior depends on data, we ask actually people, these are complicated graphs, just whether they would share data with the government, with a private company, depending on the purpose of the data, whether it's actually for the common good or individual goods, and we change data types. For people who are familiar with the contextual integrity framework from Ellen Nissenbaum, this is applying her framework, and this is work in collaboration with her. And we were trying to see whether people would be in the same advice once they were alone or after they had talked with a few other friends. And actually, it's quite interesting, but people become much more critical in groups. So groups are much less likely to share their data. But this is also like pointing at actually people who are more likely to share with private company than public sector. So we'll have a problem. good for the companies, bad for public research. Third and last, kind of uncanny convergence here. We need also to sort of move beyond, I think, like measuring judgments and responses. When we already deal with this speculative kind, so we need to get as close as possible to not like this kind of social desirability responses. We know that people are terrible at what we call affective forecasting. If I ask you how you will feel in your holiday this summer, you say great, and actually you may have not such a great time, or vice versa, we're not good. So we need to apply the methods of behavioral science. In our cases, it means things like pupillometry, eye tracking, EEG, to this speculative scenario. So vignette methods can be great, but we need to be aware that they are not sufficient. So moving to real interactive scenarios is very important. We have actually taken the challenge quite seriously. Again, moving actually some of these game theoretic interactions that we had studied before, just in a very disembodied way, in VR. So people here, in that case, we've embedded game theoretic in driving scenarios. So, for instance, you have here, you're driving and behind this car, and there's another car coming on the side, and you're in VR. In some blocks, you know that all the drivers are human drivers. In other blocks, every car is driven by an AI, and we can measure not just what you decide to do. For instance, will you let this red car pass, which is the polite, appropriate thing to do? It's not a moral norm. It's just the appropriate thing to do, whether you will actually just selfishly pass through. What's nice is that we have more than the behavior. We have also all the low level, like did you look at the car in the same way? Did you actually accelerate in the same way? And all these fine-grained measures. When people interact with the games, and there is a human confederate in the room to make the plausibility that they really interact with another human, so it's not just told. And just these are preliminary results, but what we find is that actually people indeed are more selfish when they interact with the AI-driven cars. And this is across like 10 scenarios. And just also kind of really freshly out of the oven, finding people become more and more selfish as they play through these VR things. And these are the kind of things that we couldn't get from the previous experiments. And now we can analyze also all the small like motor and eye tracking data. So I think this is really trying to get at the core of this new behavioral science, and it's very exciting. So quickly, the conclusions, I hope to at least as a take-home to say that at least a good part of the concepts that we have used and heard of here are perfectly scientifically legitimate concepts, but like many in the social sciences, they are interactive terms. It's a call to epistemic responsibility that is a new call about what we do when we study these terms that will transform the reality we're studying. And there are many responsible solutions, but they need new collaborations. So thank you all. Thank you to all the collaborators, also and people in the lab part of the funding sources as well, and of course you for your attention.
So I'm really delighted to moderate the science fiction panel, the counter-real panel, the future panel. So I thought these were enormously provocative and exciting possibilities, and I wanted to just, dive into those future realities, that we're simulating, however we're trying to simulate. So how, when I think about these futures, and you talk about, there's the long future scenario, like Dune, like thousands of generations ago, there was an Earth somewhere, that spawned all this, and we're gonna, and like super proximate things, things that could happen tomorrow, things that we imagine, being set up or seeing set up today. But at the same time, when we think about experimental efforts to do similar decomposable things like GWAS experimentation, where we just look at every gene's interaction between some complex behavioral phenotype, and we ended up discovering a lot of things that that don't account for the phenotype, because we know that there are complex interactions between those things. What's the magical balance, right, between, and I would say just, like Bruno Latour and Stephen Woolgar in their Laboratory Life book, they talk about the critical importance of actually feeling alien in some landscape to take it seriously, right? So they engaged in this whole exercise of trying to cultivate an alienness about the San Diego lab that they were inhabiting, so that they could actually see things that would otherwise be invisible to them. So how do we think about that tension between it being so familiar and so obvious, and yet, like not decomposable, because many of these things that will happen in the future will happen in clumps, in bundles, in ways that shape, a real change in reality, versus like genuine science fictions that are so long that, they're kind of implausible to imagine happening.
Well, yeah, okay, so what's the magic?
What's the magic?
Yeah, what's the magic? I think one possible response is that many of us are actually already studying things that don't exist yet. I mean, for me, one realization was that when almost 10 years ago, we started with Iyad thinking about the ethical dilemmas of fully autonomous self-driving cars. We had the impression that this was about to happen, that it was not science fiction. At the time, it felt like those fully autonomous cars were about to be on the roads, and we didn't think we were studying a science fiction scenarios. In hindsight, we were. We were actually studying a future that has not materialized 10 years later. And so I think the magic trick is to look at your paper and think, in my introduction, in these paragraphs where I'm justifying that my problem is real, it's not imaginary, it's real, can I push it just a little bit? Can I push the problem just a little bit so that it lands just right in the zone where I can no longer justify that it is currently happening? But it's still pretty close. I think that's probably a good distance.
Yeah. I think that's, in the case of what we're trying to do, we're also transporting a lot of the decomposition of the problems from cognitive science, right, or experimental economics. So I think we're helped here whenever we won't transport people in such a rich VR environment that it looks like a video game with tons of characters and Dune and
why not?
Because in these cases, like, we have a clear, our game or VR is a bit more dull, but it's very controlled. So there are very specific scenarios that we know at some point, it will come, like, here's a prisoner's dilemma type of scenario that the person will encounter. Then it's a chicken game and so on. So we've programmed things in a way that we still understand the structure of the scenario. We just upgraded like one bit, as you were saying, it's still incremental to a future scenario where some of these cars are driven by AI. But we also sort of import a lot of hypotheses about the speed of reaction. So, people are supposed, again, according to some papers, cooperative decisions are supposed to be faster than non-cooperative, so we can look at the speed of decision. So we transport a lot of the hypotheses in the way we build these future scenarios, so that at least on the human mind side, we can decompose things a bit better.
So just to push on that, in your own work on synesthesia and the way in which kind of different sensory modalities end up relating to one another, translating into each other, and to your comment about, when things are harder to imagine, vignettes are not enough. You need more sensory input, more world building. So what are the, we're not building full-on, production, massive budget, video games, but like, what are the things that matter? Like, what are the sensory aspects that matter most? We know, for example, smell is critical, or has been critical for memory kind of recreation and retention. Like, what are things that are not obvious that we would want to think about building into things that we can imagine having future validity?
So yeah, I mean, one part of the interesting sort of dilemmas, I think, that for me to move from the research on humans to now integrating human AI in interactions is exactly what you were saying, the sensory modalities. VR is essentially visual, at least with the means that we have. There's the sound a bit like in VR, so it's realistic, but we started to look at, for instance, whether people will receive the same social influence from an AI if it communicates about a perfume or an intensity of an odor versus a visual modality information, and whether that translates to the way people receive also this different sensory influence, social influence from sensory judgments from humans. But there are lots of confounds because at the moment these technologies don't exist, so they're not used to chatting with an AI on these topics. But actually, there's Orestes here in the room. We have tried to sort of build the sort of AI sommelier that Yazan was mentioning as well, to see whether it's possible to actually harness some AI to recommend wines, and whether you will listen to that sommelier more than an actual person. So we can try and move this
move the sensorium more broadly. One, did you have a thought on that, or?
Sure.
Okay.
I was trying to think in the experiments that we conduct what we think is important to maintain as part of the simulation. And often, if it's about interacting with some digital technology, some kind of app, phone app that people might have, I think the flow of attention is important, to try to respect the same flow of attention that people would have interacting with an app on their phone. To not have like jarring breaks in the experience before we maybe move on. So if you want to study their willingness to pay that people have for different features of the technology, you have to move smoothly from the presentation of the product to the order form where they can check what they would like to pay or things like that. If they have to experience a chat conversation, it has to follow the flow of temporal flow of a real chat conversation. So I think that's important. And other times when it's not about the technology that people experience, and here I'm thinking of some experiments we're conducting about social credit systems at the moment, and what kind of social credit systems people in Western democracy might actually accept as citizens. We're really paying attention to the language we're using. And so we're trying to introduce phrases that remind people that are in the future. This can be as silly as not calling people dear participants, but telling them welcome citizen, welcome to the simulation of the future French state. Mm-hmm. And then, describing giving phrases that they come to attach to the social credit system in the future that we're using, and consistently using these sentences and these new phrases to keep them in character.
Thank you. How does one think about the validity and the plausibility of these experiments when it seems like some of them, certainly when it's about the impact of a technology, if successful, could remove some of the negative impacts of that technology, right? You actually, if an experiment is large enough, and I think about, your, trolley problem, experiment, then, they themselves become cultural facts that end up shaping the way in which, things happen. Things aren't going to happen the way in which they happen if the experiment is sufficiently broad and successful. So how does one think about that kind of experiment living in the world and having impact?
Yeah, this is actually scary. Okay, I'm going to share one anecdote about one time where I got how scary that was. I'm not going to name companies or whatever, but I had this meeting with a very important person in a car company that was developing self-driving cars, and that person flipped through the Nature paper, went for the first figure when we were showing who people think would survive, and told me, yes, we can do that. Is that what we should do?
Citing your paper.
And suddenly I thought it was extremely scary that at this point, this memetic aspect of this experiment meant that some people were really considering to use those data to program cars, where we had been so careful to always say, this is not supposed to be like the final word. This is just what people think, right? But yes, as soon as it's out and it's kind of viral, then it shapes the conversation in a way that you as a scientist might not have wanted.
Yeah, I think at the moment we're also competing with non-scientific discourse or less scientific discourse on this new technology. So again, an anecdote, but I was invited to speak at the Commission for Science and Technology at the European Parliament on neurotechnology. I was very impressed that they actually put together a panel, and there were MPs, and to think about neural rights and discuss. The very, very knowledgeable panel. And then talking to some of the MPs, I just realized that mostly their understanding of the technologies are informed by Wired or Twitter, or I have no idea how to understand the experiments, the technologies. And I was told that the scientific experts behind the MPs know more, and I think that's but there is, if we want for this research actually to change something in the good way, we need also to make this link with the regulators much stronger, and we need to take them as part of our interlocutors more, I think.
Yeah, this last year I spent a year doing for Congress this National Network for Critical Technologies in the US, so I spent a lot of time in DC, and it required an enormous amount of patience. I'm sure for them, I'm sure they needed a lot of patience. I needed to cultivate new stores of patience, imagination, et cetera, just because of the strong priors that we all had about our expectations. This was actually a science fiction grant. It was basically how to simulate futures in science and technology. Ophelia, you talked a fair bit about the plasticity of metaphors and their impact, especially in the public understanding of science, but also in their life in the community. And I think you highlighted several. I think artificial intelligence as a frame itself, has had such a dominating impact on the way in which research has designed and benchmarked human capacity in so many different ways, to kind of target very specific human capacities rather than other kinds of imagined futures and complements and other possibilities. What are other of the metaphors that you've heard or that you've thought about in the context of this conference, as we think about agency and memory and morality and other kinds of things where we're extending these into agents? Which of these have the biggest consequences? Which, if we were to roll down, if you were to kind of imagine us taking these seriously and maybe exclusively seriously, we would maybe regret or want to think about rolling back. I mean, how do we think about the path dependency of big metaphors that work, like AI, that dominate a field, but they also kind of like close off all kinds of paths?
I think there's a family of terms that, for good reasons, I think we transport the terms from the human domain to the AI because of this overarching human intelligence, artificial intelligence. And so I think that in the talk by Jason, we heard about all these AI assistants, and they also start to be AI, doctors, and all the social roles that we usually ascribe to humans start to be ascribed to AI very naturally because they fulfill, but they only usually fulfill part of the function, and the social function, the human touch aspect of the doctor, for instance, is not part of what the AI chatbot, the health chatbot will do, and it gets a bit pushed away. So I think we need to be very careful that by putting some AI in some of these human roles, we're not forgetting or we are misconstruing what the initial human role consisted in the first place. So I think it's more this family of transfer that I see repeatedly in the field. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think okay. Sometimes I hear whispers of something, so bear with me, but a way to think of AI or large language models are supernatural entities. And I don't quite mean it as the Church of AI. I think that he had...
and you dig this, or?
I mean, I can hear something like this, and I think it's actually a kind of natural way for people to think of these strange minds that are not human, that operate with opaque processes, that perceive in a way that we don't really understand, and that can achieve things for us. I think that, for example, the switch to natural language interactions with AI due to large language models at some point starts looking suspiciously like prayer. You basically pray to the agent to achieve an outcome for you, not really understanding how it's going to work. I realize how weird I'm sounding right now, but I'm not saying these things are supernatural, but I'm just saying that when people try to relate to these minds, they might find it easier to use all the cognitive apparatus, all the metaphor they've been using for generations and untold generations to think about spirits rather than humans or animals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so basically run wilder. Okay, well, the people have lined up, and so we'll begin over here. Thank you.
Thank you for these two really totally interesting, inspiring talks. I would like to understand a little bit better the idea of these interactive and different kinds. And especially with the last discussion you had now, I think that the more problematic case is if you use metaphors. So it's problematic that we talk of artificial intelligence. It was a problematic choice from the beginning in the 1950s. Instead of talking of complex computer applications, they choose the word of artificial intelligence. And this is problematic because if people hear that, then they have associations of much more than these systems can do. And but inventing a new word, I think, and I want to ask you if you see this also this way, maybe not only helpful, but maybe also sometimes necessary if there are really new phenomena in the world. I mean, it's one thing to say that these LLMs, these chatbots, social chatbots, are artificial agents. Maybe this is problematic, but we have to describe this new phenomenon. We didn't have something to talk to before. This was not a human. And so what do you think about the necessity to build or to invent or to bring up new concepts, really? So like the sociologist did in the 1950s with the term of parasocial relationships, for example, maybe we would now need a new concept of like transsocial relationship or something like that to describe this new relationship that people can have to social chatbots, to being able to distinguish it from human-human and human-animals relationships and so on, but to be able to give all the people, lay people and old people, a possibility to describe in rational terms what they're experiencing.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I guess I wasn't particularly thinking about this concept, whether they emerge as a metaphor or whether they're just neologism. I think it's quite indifferent to the way they work. So a scientific concept, whatever its origin, could have been totally new. The moment the humans become aware of this concept, and that's hacking interactive kind, the awareness of other humans that this is now a category will change the way they behave. So it will change the way AI investors invest. It will change the way AI users expect the technologies to behave, and it will change the way regulators regulate the technology, whatever the origin of the term. So I think in your question I hear, is there a way to make this, the choice of our words, more careful so that we are a bit more less in the dark regarding what impact it will have in reality, and absolutely, I think that's in that case it makes the choice of terms really crucial, and sometimes just a transparent communication regarding the way we use these terms, because it's not also the point to say like everybody should use the same terminology. I know that philosophers sometimes come and be like, but the terminology police. It's just knowing, you know, if we're not sure there is agency, at some point we should be quite transparent that we're not sure, but we decide to call it, you know, agent, pseudo-agent, para-agent, when we should, but we are cautious regarding. And when we're sure there is this capacity and we are dealing with an indifferent kind, then we can use the words differently. So yeah, there's more caution needed in that case. Thanks for the question.
Oh, okay. So let's go back to the science fiction. The theory of intergalactic trade, the paper, what was this, Kruger? So it's a paper about a future technology and how it will impact markets that was done very theoretically. We do this type of work when we do theoretical analysis, and nobody screams from the roofs that this is so shocking and horrible. So what you're proposing here is something else. You're saying that we can learn something from the behavior of people that we cannot learn from theoretical models. So fair enough. So then my question is, should we involve all of the people? So back to science fiction, Larry Niven, Ringworld, he proposes there that the man is a horrific hater of women, but Ringworld is a very nice book. The world is gray, what can we do? He proposes that there are people in the world who are genetically predisposed to be lucky. So we know that there are certain people who are early adopters of technology, right? And that there are people whose behavior, needs, and choices very much correlate with what becomes the dominant technology. Is there a part in the methodology that sees value into seeking out these specific individuals and involving them into these experiments? Because those would be the people who are much more easily immersed and imagine usages for things that before anybody else. That's the question.
Yeah, I see the value in the suggestion, and the problem is that these people might come with kind of homogeneous and already settled visions of some of the futures. I mean, you want to do an experiment about mind upload, and these people who are interested in science fiction all think of the same novel, which is like the basic, that's set all the basic tropes for this, and know it's going to be very difficult to distract them from this attractor that they have. So in that case, it might be easier to actually engage with people who have no pre-existing representation of the society that involves this or that technology. Which means that you actually have to provide them with some kind of homogeneous vision with these world-building techniques that we employed. But yeah, science fiction fans and early adopters might be a great population, but yes, maybe they are also biased in their own way.
Future experts, please.
Thank you. I guess my question relates to your question just there, which is, you're not looking so far into the future, and I think that makes a lot of sense. The only thing I can kind of think of then is, no matter how much immersion you may have, the biases that we encounter from today. So for instance, if you were to encounter a chatbot therapist, but you're a bit, I don't really trust chatbots at the moment, they don't really work, I've seen too much misinformation. So they're kind of, even if they're a little bit in the future, it's very hard to let go of what you feel in the current moment. And I wonder if you've thought about any ways of mitigating that or how to counter that. And then it probably relates slightly to the AI car in virtual reality. And I'm just thinking about how you may be immersed in VR, but your actions will be quite different to some degree than if it was in the offline world. So how you react with those AI cars offline, I imagine online you might be a bit more tempted to be bold or brash since there's no like mortality really associated with it. So I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I mean, yes. So the problem is going to be, so we suggest that maybe we can use some techniques to neutralize some of the present biases and help people in the future, but how do we know that it works? Well, we don't, because before we know what works, we need to wait until we see if we predicted something useful. So there's going to be a very unsettling phase where we all try different things, see if we get different results using these different techniques, and we have to wait a little bit until we see which one gave the best ones, right? But I agree with you. Maybe it's just impossible. Maybe when we do
I don't
this,
mean to say it's impossible.
No, okay, you didn't say that. But maybe that people cannot think of, for example, ectogenesis, growing babies in tanks, and you start asking them, okay, this is going to change to labor laws about maternity leave or things like this when babies are grown outside of bodies, and maybe they just cannot escape the present. But I guess we're willing to take our chances.
Yeah, and this is thing we heard about this a bit in the early panel. I don't think we should hold behavioral sciences to higher standards because we are studying this other kinds of scenario that we have for other kinds of behavioral science. So, trolley dilemmas, moral psychological experiments. Also, there is no good evidence that actually people behave exactly according to these norms when they're in real life. There are things, there actually when some large-scale studies come, for instance, about the bystander effect, which is apparently with lots of images from video cameras is not holding in real life, but it was a very robust finding in the lab. We have to be ready for these things also, sometimes to hold true of the real world and sometimes not, because that's the nature of the methods. But I don't think it's a specific problem for the type of approaches or domains that we're talking about.
Thank you both.
So my question is maybe started to be touched on just now, but I wanted to ask, what are the examples that you would point to that most compellingly demonstrate that this enterprise of science fiction science can work and can be useful? So to be more concrete, if someone comes to you and says I just don't know if what the things you're doing here are going to tell us something meaningful and interesting. As we heard, people don't even anticipate whether they'll enjoy their summer vacation very accurately. They're just not going to anticipate how they'll actually act and think in these future scenarios. You say, well, no, look at this, it can work.
That would be so nice if we had started doing it 50 years ago at scale, and we would already have some kind of results. But I guess one example we like is the Segalnik paper on the music markets that early 20th century started to show that if people listen to music in some kind of streaming market, then some random likes at the beginning of the life cycle of a song could snowball completely virally into making it a hit, while it was entirely random which song started with the likes. And so that was, I'm not saying it's a perfect example, but it's a nice example of a paper that said, let's imagine a future where everyone is listening to music on streaming services. Why not? And people don't listen to records anymore. And let's anticipate what it might do to the success of songs to get some lucky early start in one of these markets. And that was pretty good prediction of what will happen.
Yeah, I have a slight complementary take on that. I think that's when it comes to explicit responses, we'll have a series of, again, known biases and inaccuracies. Sometimes you can compensate and find them that they're actually quite predictive. What you can do is actually to look at implicit responses. So, for instance, here, people, when we ask the people after the VR experiments whether they felt they behaved differently in the cases where they were encountering human drivers or AI drivers, they had no awareness of doing something any different. So we see it in the behavior. And if you look at experiments, for instance, I have a series of experiments to see whether people relate to AI godlike, supernatural. There's some cool fMRI experiments. fMRI is too expensive, but we'll looking at the brain correlates of what happens when you pray to Santa Claus or you pray to God. and they find different neural correlates. So you could set up someone talking with a human and then an AI and look at the neural correlates. In our case, we just look at response time and also EEG correlates of reading sentences about AI or reading sentences about gods or reading sentences about humans. So I think we can also harness a lot of the existing and super rich cognitive neuroscience methods, and I think that was part of the ideas to do serious behavioral and cognitive measurements in these scenarios, and then we bypass a bit of the issues that you mentioned.
And when you've got a huge budget, you see things like these, space race efforts where you build an actual world and people are in a capsule for like 6 months, and there's a whole host of behavioral and psychological things that are reasonably predictive of things that have and continue to happen out in space and other environments. So I think there are certainly cases of world building which are palpable and meaningful in high-risk scenarios.
Thank you for 2 great talks. I had one question first for Jean-François on sci-fi. So I'm wondering to what extent, because it's quite near-term sci-fi, you're kind of making the point that it's not dependent on some really hypothetical out there thing. And that's really what I think in the policy and ethics and safety communities we often refer to as foresight. I'm wondering to what extent it's different to exercise kind of this sci-fi hypothetical versus anticipating foresight, kind of what is likely to happen with the technologies, what can we already anticipate will happen, which then becomes a bit more of a kind of duty almost. And then we can also extrapolate sort of principled approaches. So we should think about who will be impacted worst, think about that first. And I wonder if you use a kind of principled way like that to engage your sci-fi, to kind of design the sci-fi scenarios. And then for Ophelia, I had a quick question around, I think it's a really widely, I think, accepted problem, and that and I really buy it, around the interactive kinds, that most AI terminology is of this type. And I think what the community is struggling with is just finding another way of talking about AI systems, right? So people are kind of like, well, agents sometimes, or do this pseudo agent, but what sticks in heads is still the word agent, right? So it's, I think, just a pragmatic language. Science in this case, for example, can do is sort of diagnose the problem, or also make a constructive proposal for how we might use different terminology that sort of sidesteps that problem.
Okay, so quickly also, I think it's going to be critical to articulate the forecast field with this behavioral field, if only because the forecasts are going to give you presumably the most plausible settings you can use in the experiments, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, the result of the experiments will nourish the forecast, but I mostly see this, that when you start doing your experiment, you have so many choices, so many options, and you need a way to make reasonable choices, and those reasonable choices will come from the forecasts, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think in terms of recommendation, it's true that when these terms are used within the scientific community, everybody sort of knows, or there's also room for negotiation. You can and that's fair enough. The issue becomes when it's communicated to other people from further disciplines or regulators or the public. And in that case, I think not that everything should be copied, but I think the climate scientists really got their acts together when it came to trying to communicate where there is consensus, when there is uncertainty, and how to categorize and harmonize. I'm not saying everything should be emulated, but I think that some mistakes that the climate science has encountered in this public communication should not occur again in the AI community.
So I think we'll close on the policy multiverse. Let's thank our speakers and commentators.